So I'm really looking forward to this first sort of conversation about equitable public pluralism or thick pluralism, rooted in a book that John Rauch is just publishing in January of the year ahead, with conversation feedback from Luke Bretherton. So basically, I think our goal with this conference in the next 2 days, after the Trump election, but also after Germany and Le Pen and Brexit, national populist wave of things that are playing out across the European continent, but particularly after this past week in the United States, is to sort of ask the question, what is thick pluralism, despite new pressures from the top to conform? Will healthy compromise that maintains liberty for distinct, differing, sometimes even antagonistic groups endure? This first question out of the gate is going to dive directly into that topic and area, and we're looking forward to your engagement. And structurally, each of our speakers is going to speak for 25 minutes, and then we throw it to you. And then after about a half an hour, we'll take a quick break for coffee and then come back and do one more round before lunch. Okay, so that's the basic flow and structure. But this conversation is going to dive right into all of that, particularly with lessons from the Utah Compromise and other efforts to square together religious freedom on the one hand with LGBTQ rights on the other. I've lost count of how many faith angle advisors, and we have a group of about 16 back in the United States, including some on this year's steering committee that's noted in the back of your booklet, have suggested that we really need to have a conversation about John's new book, Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. In democratic politics, as John puts it, is it a means through which radically different visions of the good, conflicts of interest, and asymmetries of power can be contested and negotiated in order for a more just and compassionate common life, with a growing number of Western democracies divided into what seem like intractable voting blocs at a time with a lot of pushback here around immigration? There are just a lot of threads over the next 2 days that will ask what, beyond shared ethnicity, beyond common religious culture, can hold together the increasingly diverse communities in Germany and the UK and France and Spain and Italy, and in this case, last week, the United States. Does the 2,000-year history of Christianity have something constructive to offer on this question? Well, Luke Bretherton has been writing a good bit, thinking a lot about this scholarly query for a long time, including a lot of learning from other monotheistic traditions on the question of pluralism, with minority status sometimes serving as a force for greater creativity. So let's get to it. John Rauch is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. He's the author of 8 books and a gazillion articles on public policy, culture, and government. He earned the 2005 National Magazine Award, the magazine's equivalent of the Pulitzer. And his books, a number of which are listed in your program, cover the constitution of knowledge, happiness, gay marriage, and political realism. And Luke Bretherton, just now leaving Duke, is the canon and Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Christ Church, Oxford. Previously, he was the Cushman Moral and Political Theology Professor at Duke University. He's the author of several books, including 23 Primer on Christian Ethics, Christ in the Struggle to Live Well, from Cambridge Press, and Christ in the Common Life, Political Theology and the Case for Democracy in 19. He's taught at King's College London, St. Malthius, St. Augustine, and this summer, the Bishop of London named Luke a deacon at St. Paul's Cathedral. So John Rauch, will start. Over to you. Welcome to Faith Angle. Back.
Well, thank you, Josh. I can't sufficiently express my gratitude and pleasure and almost disbelief at being in this beautiful place with all of you, getting a chance to know you. And of course, the climate being what it is in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based, it's especially nice to be here. Josh, I couldn't help but notice as I glanced over at your notes there that you've written at the top, "Don't bury the lead." And so I won't bury the lead. I'm here for the next 25 minutes, not as an expert, because I'm not one. I am performing a bit of an experiment with the book that I'll be publishing in a couple of months, which is to see if Christians have any interest in imprecations and suggestions from an atheistic homosexual Jew, or if you prefer, a Jewish atheistic homosexual. I come from Although I'm certainly Jewish, I've never been a believer in God. I tried when I was younger. And I was one of those people who, for many years, believed that the less religious Western societies were, the better off we would be. This book is a mea culpa for that. It is a short book. It's only 40,000 words by design and requirement, but it's an ambitious book. It covers a lot of ground, most of which I won't try to touch on here. The aspect I want to talk primarily about is the pluralism aspect of this book to launch our conversation. And I think Luke will talk a bit more about secularization. But both are closely linked themes. The starting point for me, personally, is mea culpa for what I think was probably the dumbest thing I ever wrote, which is an article for The Atlantic in 2003, 21 years ago, celebrating what I called apatheism, a play, of course, on theism and apathy, which basically celebrated secularization in the United States and also in the rest of the world, saying that since religion is the most divisive force in society and politics, that the fact that, at least in the United States, we were following the path of Europe toward basically caring less about religion, not being more atheistic specifically, but just caring less about religion, less committed to religious ideas and religious worship, that this would take down the temperature in our society and make it easier to govern ourselves. In hindsight, that was embarrassingly wrong. Of course, what we have seen in the last 21 years in the United States, as in many of your countries, has been an increase in strife and in conflict. We have seen people substitute secular faiths, like, for example, wokeness on the left, QAnon and MAGA on the right, for religion. We have seen the secularization of faith and the religiousification, as it were, of politics. We have discovered that politics, when you turn it into a religion, no longer can perform its role of being a forum for negotiating in society. And instead, it becomes a contest of identities and toxic polarization. The book tries to grapple with that, and it's structured as two mistakes and a correction. In the next few minutes, I'm going to probably dwell a bit more on the correction, but let me first tell you about the two mistakes. The first mistake was my mistake, and it's the mistake that I just alluded to, the idea that we'd all be just fine in the United States, now probably in Europe. We'll set Europe aside. This book is aimed at an American audience, though it's, I think, also relevant to all of your countries, and I very much hope that we can compare notes. But it turned out that as, well, I was about to say religion, but let me pause a minute here and say that in the United States, Christianity, and specifically Protestantism, remains our predominant faith tradition. And that's the specific tradition to which this book and these ideas address themselves. To Christians, predominantly, though not only, Protestant Christianity. What I think I failed to understand, and I think what most secular Americans failed to appreciate significantly, is that in the United States, Protestantism is a load-bearing wall, which is to say it was doing a lot of the work of upholding the kinds of values, the sense of meaning, the transmission of that sense of meaning to the next generation, the sustenance of community. It was doing a lot of the work that was making it possible for liberal democracy to do its work. I think we failed to appreciate that until Protestantism began to cave in. In the book, I discuss why I think liberal democracy in the United States and Christianity are fundamentally intertwined. Not just instrumentally. There have been people who said for years, it's a good thing that people believe in something, otherwise it would be harder to run this society. I try to go a lot deeper than that. And I argue that both the scientific materialist worldview, which is my worldview, and the Christian worldview both inherently are incapable of explaining the world on their own. And at a profoundly metaphysical level, they need each other to complete each other, even though they live in tension. Take that or leave it. What we saw was the delivery, as it were, of a prophecy made by Friedrich Nietzsche over 100 years ago, who saw as Christianity began to cave in Europe, that liberal democracy, modernity, as he saw it, was struggling to find meaning and would be very difficult to replace. All of that has turned out to be true. Alas, in the United States, Soul Cycle, for example, and MAGA and QAnon and all the rest have not been capable of replacing the roles that Christianity has traditionally played. All of you know the statistics. There are people here who know them better than I do, but the story is that the mainline churches went into a steep decline in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Maybe fewer of you know that the evangelical churches, especially the Southern Baptist Church in America, which looked to be gaining strength for many years, have now followed the mainline into rapid decline. And stunningly, a couple of years ago, the lines crossed. There are now in America fewer evangelicals than there are mainline, and every year the Southern Baptist Convention continues to lose members. So we are seeing the caving in of religious observance in Protestant observance in the United States. Moreover, in America, as the evangelical church broadly defined, this is everyone who self-describes as an evangelical, as the church has gotten smaller, it's gotten harder. And this leads to mistake number 2. This is where I get maybe a little bit audacious and discuss what I think is a catastrophic mistake that was made by the white evangelical church in America. As many of you know, in the 70s, starting with the moral majority movement, and the Christian Coalition, and so forth, white evangelicals made a choice to engage politics in a big way and align themselves with the Republican Party in the belief that they could influence politics, and not fully foreseeing how much politics would influence them. But what we've seen since then is a politicization and a secularization of the white evangelical church, such that over time it has become, in many ways, a political auxiliary of the Republican Party. That is not new. White evangelicals have been aligned with the Republican Party now for several decades. Since at least the candidacy of Mitt Romney, we've seen 80+% of white evangelicals vote for Republicans. However, what is new, and what all of you know, is that that alignment continued through the ascendancy of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, and the white evangelical church became the pillars, the stanchions of the Trump movement. And you also know that Donald Trump and the MAGA movement are in many ways the antithesis of the message of Jesus Christ. You don't need to take my word for that as an outsider. It has been a point made in great detail by Christians like Russell Moore and David French and Kristen Demez and Pete Wehner, and on and on and on. This too was a mistake, I think a catastrophic mistake. because there's been disillusionment among younger people as a result of the politicization of the church. Also, somewhat surprisingly, unlike the first wave of secularization and politicization of the church, this one has not been led from the top by the pastorate, it's been led from the bottom, by the rank and file. Pastors are in fact alarmed and dismayed by the demand from the pews to politicize their churches, to sermonize and talk about politics. They very frequently say, I of course interviewed pastors for the book and heard them say what they often say. You've all heard this, which is, we get them, if we're lucky, for 2 hours a week. Fox News gets them for 12 hours a week. It's not majorities of church members, but significant and very vocal minorities who want to see the message politicized and who email bombard them on Monday morning if they don't like the politics or lack of politics that they're hearing at the sermons. 2 years ago, an organization called Barna surveyed pastors and found that 41% of them in the previous year had seriously considered quitting. The number 3 reason for that, after basic difficulties of the job, were the politicization. As one pastor put it to me, he called it the battlefield mindset. Engaging in political strife and controversy is not why they're there. It's to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they're finding that more and more difficult. This is leading to a crisis within the church. It's leading to the shrinkage and hardening that we discussed. That's mistake number 2. So now to the burden of part 3, the correction, which is, I'd like to spend maybe the next 10 minutes or so talking about that in just a little bit of detail. So where do we go from here? What happens now? Assuming that you agree that there is some kind of crisis in white Protestant Christianity in the United States and maybe in other countries. One of the theses of the book, in fact, what I hope will be a lasting contribution, is to argue that the teachings of Jesus Christ are a lot closer, far closer to the teachings of James Madison than they are to the teachings of the MAGA movement. I draw on theologians, and in this case, most specifically, a Catholic theologian named James Allison, to try to map the values of Jesus and the values of Madison. Now, I am not here to lecture Christians about Christianity, but when I discuss this with pastors and Christians, they pretty much agree that if you had to define the Christian ethic, the message of Jesus, in 3 phrases, standing on one foot, you could do a lot worse than number 1, do not be afraid. Number 2, imitate Jesus. And number 3, forgive each other. So those values map pretty well onto the core values of Madisonian pluralistic liberalism. And they don't translate directly. The vocabularies are different. The styles are different. But be not afraid is possibly the most frequently repeated injunction in the Bible, both the Hebrew and the Christian Bibles. It has an analogy in the importance of trust in liberal democracy. You have to be willing not to be afraid, to trust that people who are very different from you, who come from different ethnicities, regions, interest groups, and so on, can be trusted in the long run to work with you and to rotate through power with you. If you lose that trust, if liberal democracy becomes a place of fear, where the loss of this election means the end of democracy as we know it, or the end of Christianity as we know it, it becomes impossible to conduct a modern liberal democracy. And we have seen the rise of fear as a central, some would argue the central governing tenet of the white evangelical church. Fear that they are losing their cultural hegemony, their cultural distinctiveness, that it will be impossible to practice Christianity in America in 5 or 10 years. And we're seeing the same thing in politics. You've all heard about the Flight 93 election meme, which was so important in 2016. If we don't storm the cockpit, we will lose control and democracy will collapse. So be not afraid translates in liberalism into sustaining trust in liberal democracy and rotation through office. Number 2, be like Jesus. There are, of course, many aspects of the teachings of Jesus, far more than I qualified to discuss here, even if we had time. But 2 very important ones also go to the heart of modern liberalism. One is the inherent worth of every individual. That's a core teaching of Jesus. It's also the core teaching of Immanuel Kant and the great liberal tradition that you never treat people only as ends to a mean they are ends unto themselves. This is the whole liberal revolution in a nutshell, that people are ends, not means. You treat them with dignity. A second aspect of Jesus' teaching, which is relevant, is his egalitarianism. People are equal in the eyes of God. Jesus, of course, directs his ministry to the least among us. He says, as you treat the least among us, you will be judged. That, too, is at the core of liberal philosophy. That's John Rawls. Imagine you live behind a veil of ignorance. You need to imagine as if you came into this world as among the least of these. What society would you want to live in? Finally, what was the third?
Forgive.
Forgive, yes, thank you. Forgive each other. The philosophy of liberalism doesn't particularly elevate forgiveness per se, but it does have some closely related concepts. One of them is forbearance, which is to say, if you win power, you do not seek to eliminate or exterminate the other side. Instead, you treat them with civility, with decency. You welcome them into the fold of liberal democracy. You continue to debate and argue and understanding that next time around you may lose and they may win. Another aspect that maps from forgiveness into liberalism is compromise, which is to say you work with others and you don't expect to get the whole loaf. The heart of the US Constitution is that it is a compromise-forcing mechanism. And compromise is in practice, in the sense, a form of forgiveness. It says you may be wrong about everything. Nonetheless, we understand we're going to sit down with you and we're going to have to hammer something out. So, if that is correct, then how do we move to a space where instead of caving in and becoming toxic to pluralistic democracy, Christianity can go to a space where it is shoring up modern liberal democracy? And the answer is, here's where we'll test whether Christians are interested in what someone like me has to say, but the answer is not for Christianity to become more like liberalism. The answer is for Christianity to become more like Christianity. The answer is for Christianity to elevate those teachings of Jesus at its own core, which are pro-liberal, and that in doing that, it recovers and elevates the greater part of itself. Who's doing that and how? Here we get to specifically the correction. And a second element of the book, which I think may surprise people, second element of the research of this book. There is a concept among evangelicals, especially Baptists, called spiritual formation, also known as discipleship. Anyone know that phrase? A couple people? Yeah, Luke does. I wasn't acquainted with it until I began doing work for this book. It roughly translates into making ourselves more in the model of Jesus. When I talk to Christians and discuss this, I saw that they're increasingly becoming aware that the church is often still doing an okay job of spiritual formation in the realm of people's individual lives. That is, there's a hurricane in North Carolina, the churches are there. They are still doing the work of ministering, in many cases to their communities, to the immigrants, to the assimilants, to the needy, and that work is still going on. But there has been a tremendous lacuna, a giant sucking sound, an absence of spiritual formation in the civic realm. Another way to put this, as David French has so memorably put it, you'll excuse the language, is it will not do to say, I may be an asshole on Twitter, but you should see me in the soup kitchen. Christianity is a united garment. Jesus is not telling us to be like him only in your personal life, but not in your civic life. And in civic life, we are seeing astonishingly un-Christian behavior from Christians. And you all know what I'm talking about. So Christians are increasingly saying, how do we fill this gap? How do we fill this void? And the answer is the need for a civic theology in Christianity, a theology that explains how it is, what it is that God expects of Christians in the civic realm. This has simply not been discussed in any important way for decades. I'll be interested to see Luke's take on this. So there are now Christians in America who are trying to work through this in an active way. I've named some of them, but they include, for example, Michael Ware and the After Party, which is a project of David French, Russell Moore, and Curtis Chang, who's a pastor. We're just beginning going down the road of thinking about how do we disciple ourselves as Christians, if you're a Christian, in civic theology. But to me, the most interesting example of this, and the one that is in fact an inspiration in this book, is something that happens in what you might think is an unlikely place, and that's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A major stimulus for this book is a speech given, and I think it was November of 2022, by President Dallin Oaks, the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at the University of Virginia. One of a number of speeches that he has given on these themes. He is next in line to be the prophet of the church, probably very soon as the current president of the church is 100 years old. President Oaks is a very distinguished man. He's a former justice of the Utah Supreme Court, president of Brigham Young University, University of Chicago law professor, deeply steeped in the traditions of the U.S. Constitution, and, by the way, in the faith of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In Scripture, the Constitution is named as an inspired document. To my astonishment, and then gratitude, a lifelong believer in equal rights, for homosexual Americans, LGBT people, watched as in 2015, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and a coalition of LGBT groups in Utah forged a compromise, a historic compromise on anti-discrimination for LGBT people and targeted, narrow, but firm exemptions for religious liberty. We then saw, in 2022, a version of that in the United States Congress, where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, among some other Christian groups, despite the fact that it is firmly against same-sex marriage and homosexuality, it regards them as a sin, nonetheless supported a compromise bill called the Respect for Marriage Act in the United States Congress, which affirmed my marriage to my husband in federal law. The Conference of Bishops was aghast at this. I mean, if same-sex marriage is a sin and a calumny, how can you possibly support a law that establishes it in federal statute? The answer to this, I found as I dived into it, goes deep into theology, and that's very important to understand. What's happening here is not merely a strategic alliance based on interest. What the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is arguing is a deep theology that says that God instructs us as Christians, as members of the church, to engage in, as President Oakes has put it, patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation, otherwise known as compromise. And that this is grounded in Scripture and the teachings of Jesus Christ, and specifically in a core doctrine of the church called agency. It's super interesting to get into that, but it might take a few more minutes than we have. It is a concept closely related to free will, but a bit different, because agency says, as I understand it, we have members of the church here who can help flesh this out if you all are interested. Traditional free will says we have the capacity to make choices. Agency goes a step further and says we must not only have the capacity to make choices, we must have the opportunity to make choices, which means we must be able to be presented with wrong choices. If we live in a society which forces people to make certain choices, that's a sin because they lose the opportunity to spiritually develop and become closer to God. So we don't want to live in a society where the government tells people what to do outside the church. It would be a sin to prescribe that. And this, in turn, means that God wants us to live in a society that is pluralistic. It's a remarkable chain of thought, and it leads through an entirely different pathway to where Madison gets to, which is even if you could impose your will on society as a whole and not have to compromise, you wouldn't want to do it, because the lifeblood of liberalism is the idea that we gain from living in a pluralistic society with people who are not like ourselves, who make different choices, and that we gain from the process of exchange and compromise. To me, it was a revelation to see that it is possible to get strictly through Christian theology to the same place where Immanuel Kant and John Locke and John Rawls and James Madison get to. And to me, that tells us something about what it may be possible for Christians to do as a matter of faith, not as a matter of instrumentality, but as a matter of faith, in shoring up the liberal tradition by recourse to core scriptural values. And that's why I'm saying the message of this book is not asking Christians to be more like me. It's asking Christians to be more like themselves. And it's suggesting that there are paths to do that, and that to see those paths, we don't need to look all that far. We're seeing them develop under our very noses. So I'll end there. I may have gone 5 minutes long.
Perfect. It's great. Thank you, John.
Is that
John,
perfect?
thank you. That was...
Thank you.
All right, over to Luke. If you missed church like me yesterday on the way in, or synagogue or mosque, well, you got a little sermon this morning, and it's personal, and it's a wonderful start. Luke, over to you. Oh, by the way, after Luke's done, if you've got a question, just put your table tent up, and we'll make sure we get a comment.
Okay, wonderful. Really an honor and a delight to be with you all. Really much looking forward to the conversation. I thought, since you're all journalists, I'm an academic and tend to kind of be over-fixated on ideas and concepts, but I would move into your territory and begin with a story. So the story I want to begin with is of a few years ago. I'm a West Londoner born and bred, and was involved in setting up something called West London Citizens, which is part of London Citizens, which is a community organising coalition. If you know the work of the Industrial Areas Foundation in the States, it's a kind of affiliated with that. And broadly, if you don't know it, community organising is a form of highly participatory, kind of street-level democratic politics, but it's always historically going right back to its kind of origins in the 30s and 40s in Chicago, worked with religious institutions. They've always been the primary membership institutions. And so as part of West London Citizens, I was involved. We were involved in a campaign against a number of hotels in West London which weren't paying their cleaners and kind of general janitorial staff very well. In fact, they were stealing their wages and they weren't paying a living wage. So we were running a kind of living wage campaign against them. This was kind of, as I said, a coalition of different religious institutions. One of the institutions in membership was an Iranian Shia mosque in West London. And there were other institutions as well as kind of residents associations and one trade unions group. We had churches of all varieties. And what we discovered was that a lot of the members of these institutions were working in these hotels. And so we were coming together to kind of secure living wage and decent working practices for them. As part of this, we needed to hold an assembly for about 250 people. And one of the few spaces you get to hold assemblies for free, where you can have genuine democratic deliberation, is in religious buildings. And so we asked the Shia Iranian mosque if we could use their mosque for an assembly as well located. This was a big deal for them. It was a very, they for understandable reasons, quite shy about being involved in kind of broader political and civic campaigns. They'd been a member of the coalition, but we thought it would be good for them in a discussion with the leadership that they kind of wanted to be more engaged in a broader kind of civic life. And so they said yes, which was a big deal. I then had to do some work. We had a number of Pentecostal and charismatic evangelical religious institutions in membership. They were worried that they would get demonized if they went into the mosque. So I had to do some work, some little theological work, had a little seminar with them around that. But anyway, it ended up, we all came together and had this remarkable meeting, about 250 of us in the mosque. We all took our shoes off, sat down on the carpets there, little table at the front. And through the meeting, we discussed these kind of issues about a living wage, wage theft, and all the rest of it. But it began with prayers, and there was kind of readings from sacred texts, and these framed the meeting. And I remember one moment I was sat with actually a Sunni, a hijab-wearing Muslim woman, Nigerian Pentecostal pastor, and myself discussing living wage. And I kind of thought, where else would that conversation be possible? And I want to suggest today that that was a genuinely democratic meeting. That was a genuinely plural meeting, and it was a genuinely secular meeting. And it cuts against many of the standard stories we hear about religion, particularly religion when it goes public. And the stories we hear is that kind of religion equals violence, religion equals extremism or radicalization, religion equals abuse, either sexual or institutional, one about the Church of England in the stories today, or religion is anti-democratic, anti-liberal, patriarchal, anti-gay, anti-immigrant, anti-something. In other words, religion is reactionary and regressive rather than progressive. Behind all these stories is a particular view of history and what can be labelled the secularization thesis. And as Jonathan said, I'm going to pick up on the secularization thesis idea, but also relate that to questions of plurality. Now, the secularization thesis can broadly be summarized as the more modern you become, the less religious you are. And it's based really coming out of kind of early 20th century sociology, religion, based on development in Europe, and then was kind of universalized to be a all-in-one thesis to describe what happened around the world. And it foretold that religion would become increasingly private and personal. And it presumed a progressive model of change where history was moving in one uniform direction, one that displaced and replaced religious belief and practice with non-religious ones, which were assumed to be passing away as they were really just superstition and we were moving into reality. Now, the actual reality is very different. Instead of a linear march from sacrality to secularity, we have the more intuitive recognition of the cross pressures pulling at one moment towards religion and another way, and another moment away from it, unmooring all patterns of belief and practice, including those of radical skepticism. We might say Jonathan's story is just kind of one of that. We might cite Richard Dawkins, the high priest of New Atheism, recently confessed, was it last year or this year, that he's now a cultural Christian as a kind of case in point. And you could think about this on a metaphor. We used to think we were stepping into a shower. History is all moving in one direction, and we would all be washed clean from the foul accretions of our superstition and our religious traditions, and kind of exit the shower as rational men and women ready for progress. Turns out we're actually sitting in the rather fetid and unsavoury waters of a jacuzzi. Everything's bubbling up from everywhere, and whether you're Jerry Falwell Jr. or Richard Dawkins, it all seems like the world is not going your way, and you're screaming and shouting about it in very loud voices while everyone splashes about around you. So rather than this story of secularization, we have this story of the kind of mutual fragilization of belief and unbelief in modern conditions. And this is really a story of what, and here I'm drawing on the work of the French sociologist Daniel Hervieux-Léger, but also people like Robert Putnam and many others. We have this story of two things. One is deinstitutionalization and how that relates to informalization. And then the other is individualization and atomization. It used to be that we were doing face-to-face community. We built unions, we built churches, political parties, bowling clubs in Putnam's case. And now I would say we have a kind of side, rather than face-to-face, we have side-by-side. If you look at the massive rise of pilgrimages across Europe, people are happy to go on pilgrimages. Massive rise of, my kids are very fond of this, festivals, massive rise, particularly in America, Europe rather than America, of festival culture. You have things like Burning Man, obviously, in the States. You can mobilize anyone to go on a march. But these are all events in which you turn up as individuals and operate side by side. They're not where you're turning up on a rainy Thursday to work out how to fix the roof and do Robert's Rules of Orders and minutes and all the rest of it. This is side by side, and it is a mass, not a demos. It's a crowd, not a people. What we have is mobilization of individuals rather than organizations of groups and the kind of thick structures of trust and cooperation they enable over time. And of course, if you're a crowd rather than a people, a mass rather than a demos, then you're much more easily manipulated, whether it's by an algorithm or by an authoritarian. So yes, we have, as Jonathan indicated, we have less bums on seats on a Sunday in church, but that doesn't mean people are less religious. They are simply disaffiliated from institutionally mediated forms of religion. The sacred, instead of being mediated by institutional means, now appears all over the place. They might not be Christian, but QAnon, Trumpism, now AFD, are no less religious phenomenon than a Eucharist. In the conversation, we perhaps talk about how populism as a form of the sacred, and whether it constitutes a re-enchantment of politics. But more broadly, the so-called culture wars are a manifestation of this change. We no longer have penultimate political debates about tax differential policies. We have metaphysical struggles about whose way of being will be considered sacred, whose way of being will matter and be the focus of attention. If I am to exist, then your way of life, your way of being must be abolished or die. And so rather than the secularization of politics, we have its unbelievable sacralization. Everything is now, whether it's climate, sexuality, guns, medical issues, they're all existential struggles. If you live, I die. If I die, you live. Now, the secularization thesis plays off two great modern archetypes. The first is a struggle between tradition and modernity, and the kind of rupture between the two. And the other is the conflict between reason and revelation. The birth of social science, I'm thinking of here people like Ferdinand Tönnies in Germany, or Weber or Durkheim, I'm sure you're all familiar with their work, is shaped by these archetypal struggles, which operate with a strict but false binary. When the story of religion is told in the media or in broader political debates, we see these archetypal binaries play out. Religion represents tradition, while the state or progressive reformers or sexual revolutionaries or whoever it is represents modernity, progress, the new. Religion represents continuity, the other side represents change. Religion represents chaos, while the other side represents order. All these roles can be reversed, with, for example, religion representing order and stability, whereas the wokesters represent chaos and change. This is the kind of reactionary reversal that lies behind how the likes of J.D. Vance and Jordan Peterson and AFD frame the cultural narrative. But what stays the same is that religion is of the past, while what is modern is contemporary and the future, whether you think that's a blessing or a curse. Of course, none of this is true. These are false binaries. What is modern gets old very quickly. Think of the telegraph, the steam engine, postmodernism. And religious dynamics are always on the cutting edge, either pioneering or adopting the new. Moody and Sankey, if you know them, early revivalists pre-Billy Graham, basically invented the rock concert. And the internet was first colonized by two things, porn and evangelicals. The same is true of reason and revelation. Reason is no less irrational than revelation. Mutually assured destruction as a rational strategy for the very scientific nuclear arms race, anyone? This is a point that the Marxist thinkers Horkheimer and Adorno made in their classic The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Reason, left to its own devices, gets highly irrational very quickly. Elon Musk being a kind of case in point. Conversely, revelation is no less reasonable than reason. I'm a theologian, it's a highly rationalistic mode of inquiry, yet they're always posed in opposition. Stories of secularization are magical thinking because they can't see that they are operating with bad archetypes and false binaries that generate narratives that will constantly lead you to tell the wrong story or misdirect your attention from what's really going on. We can excavate more and more examples of that in the conversation, perhaps. Now, the secularization thesis contrasts with two other ways of understanding this term, the secular. The first is secularism, which is an ideological framework for managing and marginalizing religion in public life. This is exemplified in French notions of laïcité, atheist policies in China or the former Soviet Union, and certain ways church-state separation gets interpreted in the US. Rather than being neutral or impartial, secularism is an ideology for marginalizing and managing religion in the name of a supposedly rational progressive order. Secularism is basically a power grab. It is used to justify centralizing state authority and diminishing the place of other institutions, and thereby depluralizing the public square, particularly the church, and so marginalizing them as centers of power that might challenge or rival state and party. And a classic case of this is Ataturk's secularization policy to marginalize the role of Islamic institutions in the formation of the modern Turkish state. Secularism also operates with the same archetypes and binaries as the secularization thesis and uses them for illiberal, highly intolerant policies while dressing up these policies as being progressive and emancipatory. Secularism is classic ideology in the Marxist sense. It simply inverts what's really happening so as to direct attention from what's really going on. Now, another way, a second way to understand the secular, one that does not operate with these archetypes and false binaries, is theological. Jonathan's called us to get more fully theological, so I'm going to do that for a moment. In this account, the secular is not what is religious against what is religious. Rather, it is that which is not eschatological or eternal. What is secular is what is temporal and temporary. The secular is a theological commitment that names this time between Christ's ascension and return. It entails seeing this time between the times and all that goes on here, especially parties, economic systems, states, etc., as penultimate, not ultimate. A key implication of marking things of this world as secular is that they are earthly and so of relative value. As the Bible puts it, humans cannot live by bread alone. We need transcendent ends or goods beyond merely material and earthly things to really flourish as humans. Political, economic, and cultural systems and commitments are the realm of bread, and so they should never be given ultimate value. If they are, that's very straightforward teaching, it's idolatry. Moreover, they are all under the judgment of Christ, and so should humble themselves and repent. The secular as a theological category carries within it a sense of the need for epistemic humility. We don't know which way things are going. We are fallen and finite, so we could be wrong. We need to listen to others, even those others who we find scandalous or difficult or ideologically opposed to us, as we don't have a monopoly on wisdom. And we ourselves are under judgment. A theologically secular view stands against both progressive visions of history, whether Marxist or liberal technocratic, and regressive and reactionary ones that say things are getting worse, the kind of common declensionist narratives we're plagued by at the moment. On a theologically secular view, history is not heading in one direction, up or down, backwards or forwards. There is no right side or wrong side of history. Rather, history is ambiguous and paradoxical. What seems like it is making life better, motorways and cars, can turn out to make things a lot worse, pollution and climate change. What seems like it is declining, religion and international relations, if we're sitting in the 1970s and 80s, can suddenly reappear as a major force. Think the Iranian Revolution, 1979 onwards. On a theologically secular account of reality, none of this should surprise us, as we should expect endless and often paradoxical reconfigurations of continuity and change. Nation-states are seen as the dustbin of history in the 1990s when globalization was all the rage. Now the old is the new. So why was the Iranian mosque, meeting in the Iranian Shia mosque, most fully secular, fully democratic, and a genuinely liberal space? Well, it was a way of resisting the secularism as an ideology for managing religion. It overturned assumptions about religion born out of the secularization thesis. Instead, what we experienced in that mosque was a temporal, faithfully secular space which allowed for a genuine plurality with different truth claims and visions of the cosmos in play, while also a recognition of a shared or common life and common goods on which all our human flourishing depend, in this case, decent living and working conditions and decent pay. It was also a properly democratic space and time, as it did not look to the state or the market to address a shared problem, but was focused on ordinary people coming together to deliberate about and form a shared world of meaning and action to which we could all contribute and benefit from. Now, the basis of democracy at its heart is that everyone should have some say and agency in determining their living and working conditions. Religious language and institutions provide the space and resources for democratic deliberation for people shut out of and marginalized by the secularized and elite-controlled spaces and times of the state and the economy. So if we are going to have a genuine plurality, we need to give up and get the memo that the secularization thesis is just bad thinking. We also need to give up on secularism as an elite mode of controlling religion as for supposedly progressive ends, but in highly illiberal, intolerant ways. And we need to embrace a faithfully secular politics. The paradox is that embracing a faithfully secular politics will lead to the desacralization of politics as such, and of becoming once more about penultimate rather than ultimate ends. Thank you.
All right, over to you.
There's a slogan there, make politics penultimate.
I'll ask a first question to you, John, about the distinctiveness of small. Is it significant that Seventh-day Adventists, members of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Orthodox Jews, are a small minority in American life to come up with or to buoy the theology of Dallin Oaks?
Is that a trick question?
Genuine question.
Because the answer is yes. Yeah, sure. What the groups that Josh mentions have in common is that they were specifically groups that have been supportive of efforts going back to 2015 to broker a federal compromise on LGBT rights and religious liberty, efforts which came to fruition in the Respect for Marriage Act. Seventh-day Adventists were at that table, as was the Orthodox Union, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a few others. And yeah, these all have in common, and have in common with me, that we're on the margins. We never take cultural hegemony for granted. When I spent time in Salt Lake City, almost a couple of years ago now, visiting the places of worship and talking to secular and ecclesiastical officials, I felt as a Jew very much at home. Because both of our cultures live in exile in some sense and in diaspora. And yeah, I think it's clearly much easier to understand the case for pluralism if you can't take for granted that you're the dominant force in society. That said, when people say to me, well, the reason the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is so interested in pluralism is because of their faith history of having been persecuted. And that's, of course, true at some level. And you all know those stories. And they're terrible stories. They're harrowing. When I got into it, I discovered it's worse than I had realized. It's a stain on American history. But I thought it was also interesting and important to realize, as I spoke to, for example, President Oaks and others, that, yeah, they don't deny that the history is there, history of persecution and marginalization, but that's not why they're doing it now. They say the reason we're doing it now is it's God's word, and we're building a global church. And you can't do those things on a narrow sectarian view of the world.
Can I just respond to that?
Yes, and then we'll go, please.
So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a necessary relationship. In fact, I think it's much more, so there are plenty of small religious communities which take on a kind of persecuted minority mindset, and it can equally generate that. And I think one of the, in terms of building on the kind of framework I laid out, actually what we, in the European context, it's when you have established churches, so with the exception of France, all the leading social democracies in Europe are monarchies and have established churches, Sweden, Denmark, Britain, etc. And so it goes to this thing of there are many more majority faiths. I'll just take the example of Britain, where the Church of England as an established church has been a very good conduit for the movement of, and it's not Christians make this claim, the former chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, would make this argument, other Muslim, head of Muslim Council and others would make this case, for their inclusion and opening out public institutions in and incorporating religious minorities into public life with rich, long-standing theologies of a commitment to pluralism, where, as an example of France points out, where you have a policy of laïcité, actually that leads to the increased marginalisation. And so supposedly kind of emancipatory discourses, which are meant to free, but in this case, just the individual, always then marginalise kind of culturally minority groups. And that's one of the, I think, paradox that a kind of certain liberal frame of reference, mentioned John Rawls and others, can never really cope with is, and this is a point people like Charles Taylor have made, cultural pluralism, i.e. a genuine plurality, rather than individualism and greater atomization. They're very different visions of what pluralism means.
Yes, great. All right, we got 5 questions. Let's start on this side of the pond with Maureen Kahn,
Hi,
economics editor at the Times, and more importantly than that, an Aspen Rising Leadership Fellow. You know, she's also a journalist.
Yeah, sometimes. Thank you so much. I found that super interesting. And I just wanted to kind of maybe bring together what both of you said, and the thing that I got out of it was this really strong sense of why the civic is really important. And it appeals to me because I think in Britain, there are places where the state doesn't really exist. So the idea of having intermediary institutions between the state and the citizen is where what we're talking about can thrive. And I guess for a lot of the Americans, that also appeals. But then we're in Europe, and we're in a country where that exact form of mobilization is seen with huge suspicion. So I kind of want to throw out there, or maybe try and get some recommendations of how in Europe, where the state is big, and the state is often everywhere. So think about the Nordic model, which is most kind of feted among, I think, Anglo-Saxons as being an ideal. I mean, that is a strong state. There is a top-down sense of conformity that comes in those countries. And so how does your model of the civic, or that intermediary space, work in a Europe where the state is so big and where getting the state out of these spaces is hard? And even that step, to take that step, so obviously, Luke, you mentioned laïcité a lot, but that was the key concept that I'm grappling with, and some of the things that I think we'll talk about later. But, you know, for me as a Brit, when I try and understand why I think Islam flourishes so much in Britain, is because we have the spaces where that civicness exists. And I know that as soon that exact same types of behavior would be seen with huge suspicion and borderline criminality in parts of Europe. So, like, how do we get this model to work? For the Anglos, I guess it's all very appealing, but how do we get it in the European context to open this conversation about why it's so important?
That's a fantastic question, and I think I'm doing so. I've just got back from Sweden. Big discussion around exactly this kind of issue. Done work in Germany. Italy, I think, is for different historical reasons and kind of weak state structure. So it's a different setup there. But certainly France, Germany. When they started community organizing in Berlin, it's now a number of cities around Germany, but they started community organizing in Berlin. They went round and they got accused of being Scientologists, and the police kind of got and so I think and you're right about bordering on criminality in certain places, Belgium being one, interesting enough. I think there are traditions in all these countries to be revived. So just take this Swedish example. There's a very rich tradition, it's still there in the folk schools, which are funded by the state, but which are kind of independent. And the folk schools, if you don't know it, are really interesting, comes out of the 19th century and is a kind of, I think there are good forms of populism and there are democratic forms of populism and anti-democratic forms of populism. And this is a rich tradition of democratic populism, which is kind of increasingly being turned to as both a form that has its own kind of institutional forms and a kind of intellectual history to be drawn on, to counter people like the Swedish Democrats. Now, the Swedish Democrats are trying to close down the folk schools because they see it as a threat. But that's all of which is to say, I think there are traditions there. In Germany, the example would be the kind of ways, different traditions of corporatism and different traditions of things like worker councils and forms of highly regional, devolved forms. Things like in banking, it has a much more regionalized, devolved structure of banking. So I think it's in these very kind of nitty, if you really look through both the history of popular traditions and of different institutional formations, which were not statist, and the move in the post-war period to have a highly statist vision of social democracy, which has now kind of come a cropper. And you see across Europe, particularly in social democratic parties, which have just been electorally bombed. I mean, it's just been a kind of disaster zone. They're trying to recover these kinds of traditions, whether it's in labor movements, whether it's in these folk traditions, which are much more regionalized, much more bottom up, and a turn back. This is why I say the old is the new. A turn back to these kinds of traditions and institutional formations in order to recover this kind of civic and social infrastructure, which first a kind of heavy statist, social democratic, and then the ways that was mobilized by parties on both left and right for highly, and I use a horrible term, forgive me, neoliberal ends. And so this kind of hyper, whether of a social democratic form or of a neoliberal form, where you just have the individual and the state. And what does it mean to revive alternative kind of traditions? So I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and you're right, there is a lot of suspicion. But I think there are resources there. But it's tough. It's super tough. And you see groups, I'm most in touch with groups trying to set up community organizing as local forms of democratic participatory politics. And they're often misunderstood, labeled, really stigmatized. And that view of democracy is almost illegible. And democracy just equals parties and bureaucracies and policy. That's it.
Good, John. How about Nicholas Pelham from The Economist? Welcome, and just hit that button. Here, hit that button if you would.
I'll just go first. I wasn't like put mine up.
Well, but you got special status. You're on this side of the pond. Yeah. Okay. You want to flip? All right. We got McKay Coppins, Shadi Hamid, and Nicholas Pelham. We've got about 5 of you waiting. Okay. So here we go. And McKay Coppins from The Atlantic.
Yeah. Thank you both. I thought those were both excellent presentations. John, you mentioned Dallin Oaks, who's next in line to be the president of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm a member of that church. And one thing that's interesting about him is that he is known within the church and among its members for giving these kind of stentorian, arguably stern speeches defending orthodoxy on things like sexual ethics. But at the same time, as you mentioned, is also arguing for pluralism, more externally outside of the church. And it made me wonder if you feel like there is any tension between leaders, Christian leaders, both trying to reinforce the moral teachings of their church to their own flock while arguing for pluralism more broadly. I think intellectually there's not. You can argue for both, but I just wonder how you see in your kind of the vision that you're painting, how you see churches navigating those two things at the same time.
Well, I'd love to hear your views on that, McKay. Actually, your thinking's probably more advanced, and you're certainly more familiar with the community. There are, as you say, 2 levels of this. One is the level of theory, and the other is the level of practice. On the level of theory, I think what you just said is correct, and that President Oaks understands, as, for example, Jews understand, and many religious minorities understand, that they are more able to adhere to their own traditions in a society in which they respect the rights of others to adhere to their different traditions, and that pluralism is their friend, and that if any one religion, for example, white conservative evangelicalism attempts to remake society in its own image, it will not only fail, it will involve the state and the church in ways that will be counterproductive. And I'm guessing in this room, most of us would agree with President Oakes that theoretically that's the correct answer. In practice, this is where I'd love for your view or Paul's view. Yeah, of course there is a tension. I asked President Oakes about this tension. In the pews, are they called pews? Yeah, in the pews,
We have pews.
in the houses of worship, folks are very conservative in many instances, especially in Utah, and they're watching Fox News and they're being politicized, not at the same rate as white evangelicals, but yeah, they're applying pressure on the church to politicize in the usual ways. And the church leadership, as President Oakes told me, is pushing back against that, and it's not always easy. It also means that the church is to some extent at odds with the larger conservative Christian community in America. For example, the bishops and the evangelicals, because they're going in such a different direction where pluralism is concerned. So yeah, in the real world, is this a tense, no, not tense, is there some tension between the church's ecclesiastical mission and the political environment it finds itself in? Yeah, there certainly is. Well, what would you say? I mean, I think so far so good, actually. I think so far the church has been able to maintain its course. Will it continue to be able to do that?
I think so too. I think that what's interesting is that the church, well, there's a couple different things going on, but we were talking a couple nights ago about the fact that I think that rank and file members of the church are probably less aware of speeches like the one he gave at UVA than they are of the speeches he gives in what's called General Conference, which is the semi-annual broadcast for members where they're kind of more sermons and moral and religious teachings. President Oakes has made an effort to bring some of these themes and messages into religious teaching. I would be interested to see how it filters down into the kind of ward level, the congregational level, because I think these ideas are really important, but I haven't seen them discussed kind of in depth or regularly at the local level yet. But it might just be a matter of time for that message to kind of filter down.
Well, one of the things that was emphasized to me was that the church works very hard to keep politics out of its worship. And because it's a hierarchical church, unlike white Protestantism, it's in a position to do that. And that if, for example, a bishop, that's basically equivalent of a pastor more or less, begins to sermonize about politics, that bishop will be corrected.
Yeah.
So at that level, at the level of practice, the church is pushing pretty hard against politicization.
And that there is a very strong taboo in Latter-day Saint culture against talking about politics in a church setting. I wonder, though, if almost counterintuitively that makes it harder for his message about pluralism and agency in civic life to kind of filter down to the ward level, just because we're generally uncomfortable talking about things that are not specifically religious or spiritual in the church context. But anyway, we can talk about that.
Just a very brief, as a parallel to that, that's exactly the same debate in Catholic Church. So the history of the Catholic Church in America is precisely how do we have conservative teaching, and you have people like whether it's Jacques Maritain or John Courtney Murray making a case that to be fully Catholic is to be fully committed to be liberal democracy. Parallel debates in Britain, and the kind of current kind of Francis wars is a contest over this question around legacy of post-Vatican II and a shift in from Vatican I, when the church committed itself in theory and the whole development of Catholic social teaching from then, which is a very developed civic theology, and they've been teaching that very broadly, to a commitment for theological reasons to a commitment to plurality, while you have internal conservative on sexual ethics, the rest of it. that obviously is, you have massive debate and rejection of that legacy, particularly in America, and the rise of things like integralism, this guy Adrian Vermeule at Harvard and stuff, which is saying, no, we need to impose a hegemonic view of our sexual ethics predominantly on society, while we're not entirely refusing the internal discipline of and church structures and denying the Pope is even really a Pope, you know. So it's So I would say there are other churches where you see exactly this. It's a play out.
It would be interesting to look at inner purity and sort of inner integrity and inner purity, inner seriousness on the one hand, and outward generous pluralism. Pairings and combinations that Murray and a lot of other people. Christina Lamb, foreign correspondent.
I have so many questions. That was fascinating. I felt a bit sad, Luke, in what you talked about the mosque meeting, because I don't think that would be possible today.
Right.
But I suppose the main thing I felt was it felt as if you were speaking in a different world to the world that we're in. We're in a world where there's more conflict than at any time since the Second World War. And much of it is driven by religion. Look at Israel, Gaza and Lebanon, even Ukraine, and the role of the Orthodox Church there. So I would like you to address that a bit, and the fact that these established churches are so discredited at the moment. It's a time of moral crisis for those churches. So whether it's the Catholic Church with sexual abuse, the Church of England, I don't know, people who are not from the UK, but it's currently in its worst crisis that it's been in for decades. And I don't know whether you think that Justin Welby should step down. So maybe if you could just sort of address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so just to take one quick example, I was at a meeting in Grimsby, which, as you probably know, Grimsby is a very depressed former fishing, kind of think Youngstown, Ohio for our American brethren. And we met in a Catholic church. It was a community organising coalition. There was the Gurdwara, there was the local mosque, there was the Salvation Army, there was Catholics were hosting Church of England and a number of Pentecostal groups. So I think this world you can go and touch, taste and smell. It still exists. It doesn't appear in the news cycle, but it's there. I can take you to examples all around Europe. And I wrote a book called Resurrecting Democracy, which kind of was charting this kind of work, just because I kept on talking to journalists and other academics, and they just didn't believe that such a thing was possible. And I'm like, yeah, no, like this is the most significant form of urban politics in the past 50 years, and no one's writing about it. But it does exist, and it continues to exist. So in terms of the international relations story, I think there's an extraordinary moment. History occasionally serves up. 1979 was, I would say, a kind of big turning point. Obviously, we had the Iranian Revolution. We had the election of Pope John Paul II. We had, really, it's the coming to fruition of, it was the CELAM conference in Latin America, which was really the establishment of liberation theology in the Catholic Church there. Obviously, that was the election year of Ronald Reagan and then Mrs. Thatcher kind of shifting over. And so the kind of rise of the moral majority, which we've seen come in. So this story about the place, and obviously it was the refounding of the BJ, it was the founding of the BJP as well. So you had right across the world this resurgence of religion into politics. I think most people miss the story, but that's when I would date it from. So this is a very old story. And religion, like any political ideology, when it's operating politically, whether it's communism or liberalism or state socialism or whatever it is, there are good versions of it and there are toxic versions of it. And why religion is specifically branded as the problem rather than liberalism, which is equally very problematic and driven wars, and it's not as progressive as liberals like to think of it as. Why that is specifically stereotyped and demonized as the problem, I think it has everything to do with secularism and the secularization thesis. Now, I think there are particular ways, as one would analyze socialism in more granular ways, one needs to analyze, and I wouldn't use the term civic theology, I would talk about political theology, which is the kind of technical term for thinking about these questions. So Ruski Mir, as a political theology within the Russian Orthodox Church, has come to prominence and is driving the invasion of Ukraine. But there are counter tendencies within Orthodoxy and counter political theologies which are committed to democracy and very opposed to that. So we would always tell a more pluralistic and historicized story of something like socialism, but we never do that with religion. It's just because of the dominance of the secularization thesis and secularism, it tends to get branded in a particular way. I just think we just need to give up on, these are just very bad stories, and need to think about it in a more plural, inherently plural and historicized way. And then we can tell more granular stories about good bits of religion and bad bits of religion, just as much as we tell a story about good bits of capitalism and bad bits of capitalism. We need to have those kinds of stories.
I asked you about moral crisis.
Oh, moral crisis in the Church of England specifically. Yeah, I think the Church of England has been in a moral crisis since about 1640. So no change there. Whether Justin Welby survive. Yeah, I don't know actually.
Now that you're a deacon, you want to say this is off the record?
This is off the record. Okay, this is off the record. No, I mean, I think that if we'd had this conversation 10 years ago, I would have said, yeah, it'd be gone tomorrow. In the world that Trump made, turns out people can stay in power and do terrible things. So and that's no less true of, Jerry Falwell and Justin Welby. I'm not making equivalents. I'm just saying the calculation seems to have radically changed for all leaders, whether you're the head of BP or whether you're the head of the Church of England. So I don't know my metrics for that anymore, as about whether leaders stay on due to a scandal or not. I don't. My gyroscope is
Isn't that terrible? I mean, you, Jonathan, were talking about learning from the values of Jesus Christ. If the leader of the church doesn't step down when something so bad has happened, then...
No, I agree. I mean, my descriptive question as to what will happen is different from my normative evaluation of when it should happen. That's that. I'm still making a judgment about whether he should or shouldn't. If you ask me a descriptive question, I don't know. I'm not sure I have good metrics for that anymore.
Well, so that we don't end on that note, let's have one more question and then we'll take a coffee break, okay? Shadi Hamid, columnist for the Washington Post.
What's that?
Yeah, primarily for John, but I'd be curious, Luke, what you think as well. I mean, John, you said something to the effect of that Trump or Trumpism is the antithesis of Christianity, and you cited David French, Russell Moore, and others. I think people, like most of us here, probably like David French or Russell Moore, their friends, also a faith angle. But they are representatives now of a distinct minority within American Christianity. And especially after David French endorsed Kamala Harris, I think that limited his influence even more within mainstream Christianity. But I think there's also just this point that at some level we have to judge religions based on the majority of their adherents. And if we're kind of cherry picking from a small minority to say that Christianity should be something other than what it has become, that maybe that's not the best way to approach it. Similarly, if you find like a very heterodox minoritarian form of Islam and say this is what Islam should be, but at the end of the day, you have a mainstream and you have you have a normative tradition, and So I guess what I'm getting at here is that if the majority of American Christians, and particularly white Christians and evangelicals, have decided that Christianity isn't in opposition to Trump, or that Trump isn't in opposition to Christianity, at some level I'm willing to defer to them. They have probably a better sense of what their own interests are, in that regard. So I'd just be curious how you would contend with that. I think that what many pro-Trump Christians argue, and in my own conversations with some of them as well, it's not so much that Trump is Christian. They're willing to acknowledge that Trump is not a great moral person. I think their argument more is that Trumpism, or the Republican Party under Trump, are better vehicles for Christian values, that Trump is a flawed vessel, and we sort of use him as an unideal means to get to a better end. And considering that, at some level, should we listen to that? Should we defer to that interpretation? How would you respond to that interpretation?
Well, I'm not a Christian, so in that sense, it's not my job to respond to that, because I'm an outsider to the tradition. That said, I think it is a mistake to view Christianity or any religious tradition as just kind of a free-floating grab bag of political, social, and cultural views, which adapts to the people who claim that tradition at any given moment. I think that leads to a kind of relativism which can lead to a complete eclipse of what that tradition actually stands for. So I side with those who say, wait a minute, before we go down that road of social and cultural relativism, let's look at Scripture. Let's look at Jesus' teaching. And I side with those. Now, again, I'm an outsider, so I don't really have standing to do this. But I have concluded that Russell and David and the others are right. That objectively speaking, the teachings of Jesus really don't align with the behaviors that we're seeing from the MAGA movement. Now, I realize that one can, and lots of people do, justify their votes and use phrases like God's wrecking ball and that sort of thing. But my interests, both for the good of democracy and for what I think is the truth of Christianity, its deeper values, is to try to understand what I think are core values of Christianity can be re-elevated within Christianity. I completely understand that might be a losing battle. It might be that the version of white Protestantism we have today is all we're ever going to get. Russell, among others, for example, Tim Keller, when he was still alive, are warning Christians that if they continue down that path of secularization, politicization, idolatry, and in the view of some blasphemy, they will continue to slide into a world where they are just indistinguishable from the political environment around them. And as Russell points out, well, if you tell people, especially young people, that religion is indistinguishable from politics, they'll take you at your word. And they'll just be political. So they see that as a suicide pact.
One other data point to put before you is just that 17 of 66 books in the Protestant Bible are prophets. So there's something about the prophetic tradition of standing up and saying, despite what the groundswell of momentum, may be within, whether you want to say 62 million evangelicals in the United States or 68 million evangelicals in the United States, the prophets still have some role if you look religiously as opposed to...
I'll just add footnote, I'm dominating too much, but where my book ends actually is with a sermon given by a marvelous theologian, Mark Labberton, who emphasizes that Christianity is an exilic religion, and that when it gets away from that, when it wants to think of itself as dominionist, it loses itself. And he, among others, want to return Christianity toward its exilic version of itself. And I think there's something both deeply right and deeply beautiful about that vision of Christianity. Even, as I say, I'm not a Christian. I can't make the choice for them. They'll have to make it themselves.
I'd be curious if Luke has any thoughts on that.
No, that was really good.
Hey, the great thing about tonight is you got John Decker, who covered Trump for 4 years. You can get him at dinner. Get him at dinner, and get this guy at dinner too. All right, so let's take a coffee break. Be back in 15 minutes. Okay, we're back, and maybe we can start with a question from Katrin Benhold of the Berlin Bureau of the New York Times.
Just and yet, okay. No, I just my problem is I'm really sorry about your computer working, but I've got just really an issue with the ones.
No problem.
Maybe I can speak very loudly.
I can hear you.
Yes.
So thank you both very much. I thought that was fascinating, and I've got lots of notes and lots of ideas, questions. This concept of agency of trust that you brought up was pretty interesting to me, particularly agency, this idea that you have a real choice. And I was hoping to ask my question about the sort of economic and class aspect of this whole debate, because I think to understand Trumpism and understand that any of the countries, you have to sort of go back 20, 25, maybe 30 years and look at how we moved from a post-war world where, you know, a family's fortune would be certain to rise in the next generation, at least on average. That sort of stopped being the case right after really the Iron Curtain came down. And I think that matters in this debate. And I think agency, to the extent that, you know, if you're, you know, downtrodden and poor and, you know, your choice set is very, very limited. And I think that is one of the things that we're seeing, the frustration about that is one of the things that we're seeing now. To me, it was very striking the way that the two major crises of the last 15 years have played into paving the ground towards Trump and certainly towards the AfD in my country, Germany, where I was a correspondent for the New York Times for the last 6 years. You know, the financial crisis really was a major moment. And it was a moment that showed us that the people that are paid the most in our societies, and in that sense, on some level, are valued the most in our societies, were the ones who sort of, you know, drove the car against the wall, then got bailed out by the taxpayers, who in turn paid with mass unemployment and you know, real hardship. And there wasn't a real fundamental shift. There was a lot of talk of it at the time in the economic system following that. Fast forward 10 years, we have the pandemic, where we suddenly saw that the people who are the least paid and least valued, you could argue at some level, by our societies are actually so-called key workers. They're the ones who stopped everything from descending into anarchy. You know, not just the doctors, the nurses, the clerks, the delivery drivers, etc. And so we have these two crises that really held up a mirror to our society. And again, to you two as religious experts, I would love to know, our economic system, it strikes me, one that represents values that are as far away from sort of true Christian understanding. And I speak as, you know, a cultural Christian, actually, for lack of a better term, rather than a believer. And so I wanted to know to what extent we can even hope to defeat populism without addressing the values question within our economic systems in a very serious, fundamental way.
Well, thank you. I'll take first crack at that. I assume it may be addressed to me, but
it's to both, really.
So there's two ways to approach this, and thank you. That very big question of many people who either have been left behind or felt left behind, and it's not, of course, just in the United States. The trend toward authoritarian populism is global, and there is an immense literature dedicated to understanding why that's happening. I think if you had to name the three big causes that are affecting Germany, Italy, Hungary, Poland, United States, and so forth, Brazil, you name it, those three things are, number one, the epistemic crisis, the rise of the internet, post-truth, all of that. Number two, the global migration crisis. And number three, the collapse of Christianity. Those things are happening across most of those countries. And we could have a whole conversation about the nature of those changes and the economic problems that are going along beside them. But I'm going to bracket all that as a separate conversation. And in this book, and just in the next 40 minutes, I think we should all perform the exercise of taking religion seriously. We secular people tend to want to reduce faith to a composite of economic and social and cultural factors that are driving behavior. And it's not. Faith is faith. It is about man's relationship with God. It is about, if you're a Christian, the words of the Bible and the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so I want to suggest that we need to take seriously the prospect that what is wrong with Christianity, or what is wrong with society, I should say, has something to do with faith itself, independent of people left behind, the financial crisis, all of these other things. And that we seculars are missing a big part of the picture if we don't take faith as a thing in itself and try to understand it. And I feel that until recently, I was not doing that.
But I guess just let me just come back quickly before we.
Yeah, sure, of course.
You basically, you've been saying your main point.
One of the main takeaways I have is Christians, should become Christians again. And to me, that means live their values, the values they preach, the scripture and Jesus Christ taught. And to the extent that you have an economic system whereby, we are all governed, to the extent that does, not at all reflect those values, do we have a problem? So I'm not trying to skirt the religion issue as much as to point to the fact that, is this an incredibly unchristian and incompatible system with Christianity that we're talking about?
I'd love to see them talk about it that way. The Pope does, actually, to some significant extent.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're asking exactly the right question. I mean, I think that, so you can draw a historical analogy, I think one can over-determine it in this way, but I think this is a strong historical parallel with the 1920s and 30s in both Europe and America. And you had there, if you think about the unbelievable changes on every aspect of life, from how we worked to the structure of family life to the incredible changes in technology that occurred through the Industrial Revolution, and then the rise of and centralization of states, the kind of dominance of industrial economy, everything changed. And societies struggled to metabolize that level of change. And that was a crisis of agency. We had to go through 2 bouts of totalitarianism, 2 world wars to reach a kind of new settlement, kind of some version of social democracy in Europe and kind of market democracy, liberalism with a strong element of social democracy coming out of the progressive era of the 20s and 30s. Again, largely in response to the Great Depression, but we can also put in there the kind of flu, the Spanish flu, etc., and war and all the rest of it. I think we've been through a similar huge set of changes, technological, the financial crisis of 2000, 2008, you're right to point to, I don't think it's ever kind of reckoned with the massive change that led to obviously a pandemic. And there's a crisis of agency. People don't feel they have any sense of control. And I think the issues Jonathan raised, I think, is symptomatic of that deeper crisis, whether it's migration or whatever. And I think we've lived through an era as the dominance of laissez-faire capitalism in the late 19th, early 20th century, of a kind of dominance of neoliberalism, when to even ask questions about the meaning, purpose, and character of the economy was seen as somehow not just impolite, but stupid, irrelevant. I mean, I raised a question about this in my university. We were having a big 5-year thing, and I said, well, in American universities are basically neoliberal kind of enterprises now. And I said, well, we're thinking about the 5-year plan for Duke, what's the meaning and purpose of the university, and what kind of quality and character of relations do we need to cultivate in order to fulfill that meaning of us. Luke, you're so funny. Oh, how fun. I'm not joking. Like, what the hell are we if we don't ask questions? If we at universities don't ask questions about meaning, purpose, and character, what the hell are we doing? Like, I was laughed out of the room. That's tragic. And so I think so when you're faced with that kind of crisis, a fundamental crisis of agency, as we saw in the 20s and 30s, and this is someone like Karl Polanyi in his classic book, The Great Transformation, draws this out. Highly recommend it to you. I think it's as salient now as it ever was, written in 1945, trying to make sense of the rise of fascism, was you basically got two choices. You either try and stabilize life, because you cannot live life. You can't get housing, you can't work out what you don't have your precariousness of your job, kind of check to check people. You've got two choices. You either turn to an authoritarian demagogic figure who promises to stabilize life and bring order, or you turn to democratic movements. In the 20s and 30s, the massive rise of the labor movement and other democratic movements, and we've seen the same in the media response to 2000, 2008. Tea Party rise on the one side, which leads into Trumpism, and Occupy on the other side, and Bernie. And we can think about the environmental movement, other movements on the left, and I would say the wokesters. You know, how do you stabilize life when everything about life is changing and you have no control, and you're always rendered a passive agent determined by others, your life, and so you have no control over your living and working conditions. And really some form of authoritarianism leading to totalitarianism, or some form of democratic life, economic democracy and political democracy, where you have some say and agency over your living and working conditions, and where questions of meaning, purpose, and character of life together are central. Those really are the only responses, and that's what we're living through. But we keep calling it something different. So I just think the fundamental crisis is a crisis of agency.
I'll just enter Mr. Burke, not a disagreement, but a cautionary note, which is this is kind of a version, a descendant of a version of the debate between Marx and Nietzsche. And Marx says it's the economy, stupid. This is all about a crisis of capitalism, which is undermining basic values and dissolving everything we know, and so it's an economic question. And Nietzsche comes along and says, no, this is something larger. This is about the collapse of the traditions that have provided the values, the transcendent values that modernism depended on. And it goes much beyond economics. Nietzsche came up with the wrong answer, which is people like me should make the moral decisions. But I take Nietzsche's side in that argument. I think this is what we're seeing now is deeper than problems of people feeling left behind or coping with economically, or coping with inflation or the price of eggs. I think this is a question about where do people look to get values in a secular age.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, I'm not making an economic reductionist argument. I'm saying,
I don't accuse you.
the questions, questions. Yeah, no, I agree. I think the questions of meaning, purpose, and character are always central. The point about about capitalism as an economic system is that it refuses, and there's an argument I have with my colleagues at Duke in the economics department. It refuses the salience of those questions, and as I would say liberalism does. It's neutral. You can decide the meaning and purpose of your life. That's an individual choice. And so there is the centrality of determining what is the good in the good life and what is the shape of our common life and what meaning and purpose does it has. That's ruled out of court. That's just an individual decision. And so the kind of liberal, neoliberal coherence is central to that. Now, I think there has been this move, and listening to Jonathan, you get a progressive version of this move of rediscovering of Nietzsche's saw Christianity as the problem. People like Tom Holland, Jonathan see Christianity as the answer, but it's not an answer because you want to confess Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. It's an answer because European civilization depends on Christianity. Now, Nietzsche thought that was a problem, people like Tom Holland, Jonathan think that's a good thing. There's a very nasty version of that story. Oswald Spengler, who was a hugely influential German kind of historian, philosopher in late 19th, early 20th century, had a similar view. He wasn't interested in Christianity as a theological project. He was interested in Christianity as the anchor against the Enlightenment story. Christianity was the anchor that got you to liberal values. Now, if you go back, I used just the example of France, of the Action Française in 1890s, got going really big in the 20s and 30s, basically led into fascism, and the Vichy kind of supplied a lot of the leadership for the Vichy regime. Their leaders were Nietzscheans, explicitly Nietzsche. Charles Marat was a kind of Nietzschean, but he saw Christianity as the anchor for the greatness of French civilization. And it was basically a kind of make France great again project. And the strapline was defending family, faith and flag. And hundreds and thousands of Catholics joined Action Française in the 20s and 30s. The Pope Pius XI had to issue an edict against it and say priests would be defrocked. We see exactly the AFD, Swedish Democrats, that these leaders explicitly said they're neo-pagans, but they see Christianity as the cultural anchor to essentially a white European civilization and its rationality and all the rest of it. So the shift from an Enlightenment, we need to reject Christianity to free ourselves from superstition, is now switched. We need to embrace Christianity to have rational kind of values. Now there's a highly racist white supremacist version of that, and take someone like Tom Holland's Dominion, there's a kind of nice, cuddly, progressive version of that. I think both of those are very problematic kind of ways of framing things. But the question of the kind of intersection of values, meaning, purpose, character with political economy absolutely needs to be held together. And the problem is we've lived through, as we did in the late 19th century, an attempt to separate those two things. I don't think they can be separated. And that is central to the teaching of Christianity. We used to have huge debates about usury. The whole of our economy rests on usury. Islam still has lots of interesting things, important things to say about usury, and is held strong. Christianity gave up the ghost in about 1450. Or someone put it down to Calvin. But yeah, so I think you have to hold political economy and questions of meaning, purpose together, or else the whole thing goes to hell in a handcart. And always the struggle is to re-embed money in a broader form of life where questions of meaning, purpose and character are. So money serves people, not people serves money. And that's just always the struggle. And Marx separated it off, and Nietzsche thought you could just talk about values. I think you have to hold those two things together.
Beautifully said.
All right, we've got 4 questions waiting. I have an addendum to that answer at the very end if we get there, but we've got Nicholas Pelham, Emma Goldberg, Bruno Massais, and Guillermo Alvarez. So Nicholas, you're up first from the Middle East desk.
Emma, you put yours up before.
Nicholas is the most generous local host. He's probably got a great question, and he's a great moderator.
Have you ever seen Brits queue up in the tube?
Emma Goldberg from the New York Times.
Thank you. This has been so fantastic. First of all, I thought what you said, Jonathan, about the sort of bottom-up politicization of the pulpit was fascinating because it seems kind of resonant with a lot of what's happened among in the Jewish community, where you've seen like kind of observant branches, observant movements in Judaism crater, and a lot of younger generations of Jews have anchored themselves to Zionism. And then over the last year, as many of them have rejected Zionism, they realize they don't have their observance and they don't have Zionism. And so what they have left is sort of bagels and pastrami, which is not a religious practice. And I think has sort of led to an existential crisis in the Jewish community about, what has trading out observance for a sort of political Judaism done to the community. But I wanted to ask about, you talked to Jonathan also about like taking faith seriously. And I think a lot about the entanglement between faith and wonder and the degree to which technology is sort of a wonder killer. Like, when you think about the tension between rationality and faith, there's just like you have instant information at your fingertips. You don't even allow your brain to sort of settle into the mystery of any question before reaching for information and data. And when I think about the three kind of tenets of Christianity you brought up, they all seem sort of antithetical to the way technology has rewired our brains in a lot of ways. Like, be unafraid. We're all in constant fight or flight mode because of social media. And forgiveness, like these systems actually incentivize and reward constant antagonizing. And so I was wondering, and this seems like potentially something that'll just continue to accelerate with a generation that's really addicted and actually grew up completely entangled, every function of daily life completely entangled with technology. And so I'm curious how this project of sort of wresting Christianity back to itself becomes more complicated, and particularly with a generation that cannot envision life without the internet.
Oh, what a big, important question. And I can't answer it because there are powerful arguments on both sides. To generalize from the question, what post-liberals have been saying, this is from Yule and Deneen and people like that, is that modern society has made it essentially all but impossible to be a person of faith. And Deneen was originally saying we have to retreat sort of back into our own private communities, and now he's saying we have to take over the cultural realm. But they're saying, yeah, liberalism, modernity has made it just very, very difficult to have a community of faith, family, tradition, and fundamental values. And there's another view which says, well, it's always been difficult to be a spiritual person in a modern age. That's been true for several hundred years. And yet people have managed to do it. One of the things that most impressed me about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'm not alone in being impressed by this, is the variety of social technologies that they bring to bear on maintaining a strong, thick faith community. And they're actually, globally, they're growing. I think in the US, they're holding constant, though it's a little hard to know. Partly, specifically, because they are emphasizing the importance of community and family, and they're not backing down in the faith of technology, and that's working. So that second school of thought says, well, if you want to look at why Christianity is struggling in the modern age, maybe you should start, Christians, by looking in the mirror. Maybe you should start looking at your doctrines and your political and social behavior and whether that's attractive to people before you blame your smartphones. And I don't have a strong dog in that fight.
I just killed the wonder and looked up 6.5 Mormons today in the United States, 16 million in the world. So just that's snuffed out, the wonder there. But that certainly growing, holding strong and growing in the world, right? You might say, yeah. Want to touch on tech?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of technology, again, it's not the intensification of things like social media. I think these are intensifications of very deep currents within the modern condition. Industrialization, there's a huge raft of anxiety. People like William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. And you can, in some ways, I read the strong strands of socialism, for example, are really an attempt to recover an agrarian rural economy, moral economy, for under modern urban industrial conditions. Now there's hyper-progressive utopian strands of socialism, different, but so I think you see anxieties around technology and how it deracinates, atomises, alienates, and leads to exploitation. This is just a new version of that. The place of religious formation under conditions of technology, what Jonathan called kind of spiritual formation, discipleship, that's been a challenge. I do think, though, this goes back to a kind of democratic question around, are we willing to chat? We're quite capable of designing technologies, particularly algorithms. Take just one example in fintech around using blockchain technologies to enhance social relations and peer-to-peer lending structures, for example. as against the use of technology and the algorithms to concentrate power and disassociate and atomize. So I think the democratic challenge, as it was with industrialization, were factories going to be concentrate all the power in Mr. Ford or in the unions? We're just at the beginning of that struggle, and it's also a spiritual struggle, and churches and other religious institutions also need to join in that struggle. Will technology be designed to enhance conviviality and relationality, or will they be designed to concentrate the power, economic and political, in the hands of the few? I think that's always been the struggle in the modern. We're just at a new bout of that struggle. We just need to wake up that that's the struggle before us. But there's no reason we can't use legislation and democratic movements to ensure the algorithms serve us rather than we serve the algorithms.
It's a great big question, though. We've had John Haidt and Jean Twenge and others. Yeah. Let's go to Guillermo from El País. Yeah, but I'm the moderator. I'm in charge.
Our goal here is to keep Nicholas out of the
It feels like some weird parlor game I've stepped into.
As English is not my first language, even it's not the second, I take some notes to make my point. Otherwise, it can be a disaster. So I want to defend secularism. Look, I'm very sorry. I think that there are two very rooted traditions in Europe. One, as we are seeing a lot in Spanish far right and even right, is the idea that you say that Europe can only be Christian. In Spain, which was during centuries a multicultural country, and still it's completely absurd. They try to erase 700 centuries of Muslim heritages, and they try to erase 1,000 years of Jewish heritage. Even if half of our towns, beginning with Madrid, had Arab names, and even if what we eat in Christmas, like marzipan, it's a sweet that has a completely Jewish heritage. So I think, and the symbol of this is the Mosque Cordoue, the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoue. I don't know if you have followed the polemic, because in the 60s, for example, there was a economic from a lot of religions, Congress there, and the Catholic Church has no problem to allow Muslims to pray in the mosque, even if it's a cathedral they consider it's a mix of heritage. Now it's completely forbidden. It's full of saints. There are security guards trying to expel Muslims who try to pray there. So that's one of the heritage a part of Europe is trying to. And the other heritage, I think, is secularism. Right. And it's not new. I mean, for me, the secularism began in the most important document in the European Union, which is not in the 20th century, is the Westphalia Peace. I mean, after the 30 Years' War, they decide there was a peace between a lot of European countries who say, okay, you don't have to share the religion of your prince and of your king. Otherwise, it will be impossible to make a multicultural, multi-religious Europe. It begins only with Catholic and Protestant, and then it has grown until the 21st century with I think, I was going to say most, but all European countries tolerate all the religion. So my question is more a debate than a question, and the question will be, you don't think that even if we take religious seriously, and we think we have to take religious seriously, the only possible heritage that we have to live in a multicultural, multi-religion, tolerant, it will be the old tradition of the Westphalia Peace Treaty and the multiculturalism, the secularism?
Yeah, no, great question. I just dispute the narrative. So I think there's a third story. So there's a throne and altar, heavy-handed kind of integralist, particularly Catholic tradition, which is we have to have a kind of Christian nation, and the state and the church work together to enforce a kind of religio-political hegemony, and that's coming back with force. As you say, there's a kind of reaction against that, but the Westphalia strand of secularism is, as I said in my presentation, that's no less an ideological hegemonic project. It's actually not pluralistic, and it's tied to the formation of the nation state and the party political structure, and the eradication of all forms of rival institution. It's no coincidence that the evisceration of civil society goes along with that kind of Westphalian project. And I think that project has come a cropper. There is a third tradition, a wonderful tradition articulated in Spain in the kind of convivencia tradition, where it's precisely you have a form of religious life which holds open space for multiple other kinds of religious life. And it's a genuine plurality that doesn't say there is only the state and the state determines everything, which is what the Westphalian structure does. It says there are multiple cosmologies, there are multiple claims to the truth, there are multiple visions of what it means to be human, and we need to have a space that allows for genuine, in public life, determining everything from healthcare policy to economic and industrial policy, questions about meaning, purpose, and character. And the kind of secularism as a hegemonic ideological state-forming structure refuses that. And so I want to say that there's a third option, which is recovering traditions like convivencia, and all European countries have them, and other histories, which allow for a genuine plurality. So that would be my response.
Nicholas Pelham, The Economist. It's the right time, I think.
I think Guillaume, in part, has already kind of articulated the question I was going to ask. But it does seem that there is this kind of tension with, I think, within what Jonathan was talking about, between kind of faith and power. And I think it's quite hard to divorce Christianity from Christian tradition and Christendom. And it seems that in a sense, you're trying to do something which is quite Protestant, sort of going, or Salafist, sort of going back to the original text and divorcing 2,000 years of history. And that history matters, and it really affects how we view how the secular successors of Christendom are ruling today. And I think there is something. So it's kind of, I just sort of wondered throughout whether there's this. We're somehow seeing that there's a struggle between secularism and religion. And I wonder whether, in some sense, that's a false dichotomy, because one draws on the cultural baggage of the other, and how they rule is how secularism rules is actually comes out of how Christianity ruled. And when you have an understanding of kind of division, a binary division of society into sort of those who are damned and those who are saved, and damnation and salvation, that affects how, the degree to which a Christian tradition can be relevant for a multicultural society. And I'm fascinated by what Luke said about convivencia. I just wonder, what are the kind of scriptural and Christian roots of that? Where do you draw on Christianity for a multicultural society? And it's something which I think Islam may actually be far better at doing than Christianity, because it does have a notion of people of a book. It was happy for a mosque and a synagogue and a church to be side by side. And the history of Christianity in the West is one which kind of eradicated other religions and other expressions of faith, and even persecuted other denominations and locked Jews in ghettos. And like how relevant is Christianity today for a pluralistic society?
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think, I'd resist the idea that, this is why I keep turning to kind of historical examples. I'm precisely resisting that Protestant move. We just got back to scripture and a kind of back to basics model. And I know that's, I think, I like David French and Russell Moore, but they are very, very evangelical Protestant, and it's a very particular view they represent. I think that the Christianity is much bigger, obviously bigger tent, and there are many different views. And I don't want to deny, I think absolutely we need to face head on the horror of Christendom and the complicity of Christianity in Western colonialism and slavery and the Holocaust. All of that has to be addressed and faced unflinchingly. I don't think the idea that Islam is somehow better than Christianity on this score, you know, yes, we have the parallel in Spain in the kind of move to eradicate histories, exactly the same moves happening in Turkey under Erdogan, you know, so just look at the same in India, you know, so the eradication of alternative histories and traditions in, I would argue, state building consolidation projects and a kind of monopoly faith, yes, that is exactly what we see around the world in all faiths. Sri Lanka and Buddhism, you know, everyone's doing it. But I think in terms of Christianity, and that's, you know, a lot of my work has been writing, you know, read Christ in the Common Life. It's a big book on exactly this question. The resources there within Christianity for a commitment to democracy and plurality as a theological, Christ-centered commitment. And I think, I mean, you know, but there are rich histories and traditions there to be drawn on, even as the full horror is wrestled with. But I don't think Christendom was never monolithic. There were always counter traditions and counter moves, even within, so take one example, you know, the conciliar tradition to pluralize the structure of hierarchy, which I would argue actually has and there's lots of historians who make this case, has a strongly kind of the importance of deliberative means of judgment making held in whether in convocations, councils, conciliar traditions, as a counter to the centralization of decision making in a pope, in a bishop, in a that's always a wrestle and a tuggle, and think about things like the sanctuary movement, which has been picked up on in the central, you know, whether in the States or Europe, churches being used as sanctuary for those who are undocumented and chased by the security services and the rest of it, and trying to be deported and resisting that. That's a long tradition which was contesting centralization of authority structures throughout Europe, whether by the church or by the local lord or the king or whatever. So I think there are these rich histories there to be recovered. They're real histories. They feed into, I think, important commitments to democracy, not as a program of statecraft, but democracy as a social practice for negotiating a common life between competing visions of the good and asymmetries of power. That's fundamentally, when I say politics, that's what I mean. Because politics fundamentally, we have, as soon as you step outside your house and probably inside your house, you are going to meet people you disagree with, dislike, find scandalous. And the central moral problem of any form of politics, and addressed in all religious and philosophical traditions, is how do you respond to the stranger/enemy? Because we cannot survive as human creatures without others. Can't survive, let alone thrive. And so as soon as you need others, you're going to meet people you disagree with, find scandalous, find difficult. And at that point, you've got four choices. You can either kill them, a lot of human history does that. You can either create a system to coerce them, because you don't want to listen to them, you don't want to talk to them, or you can make life so difficult that you cause them to flee, you persecute them and the rest of it. All religions do it, all philosophical systems do it, whether it's atheist communism or Catholicism or Islam or Buddhism. We all engage in plenty of histories of oceans of blood at all of our doors, and we just all need to be on. Liberalism is no less free of an ocean of blood than Christianity. We just need to be honest about that. Or you can do politics. You can negotiate some kind of common life amidst competing visions of the good and asymmetries of power without killing, coercing, or causing to flee. And I can give you a long history of political philosophy, political theory, but that's what it boils down to. And that's really the choice. And I think religious people have a lot of resources for making that choice for politics rather than the other three, but they also have lots of options and reasons theologically and otherwise. And my job is, how do you big up the commitment to democratic politics and not killing, coercing, and causing to flee. But I think that's also a choice for whether you're an atheist or whether you're a good liberal progressive or whether you're a techno-utopian. I think everyone is faced with that choice, and it's no one gets off the hook.
And you asked about specific biblical passages, and I think we had a speaker a couple of times ago who talked about the rain falling on the just and the unjust alike is characteristic of our age that we're living in. The idea of wheat and tares being sown side by side and not yet divided, so that we're in this age of both and he said, you had Leo the 13th, the Pope in the 1890s. You had Abraham Kuyper about the same time arguing this directional way. And of course we have Vatican II. But there's a long argument within Christianity for the pluralization of society and the opening of things. And I would just add as an addendum, this project got started about 25 years ago, right after Peter Berger wrote his book, The Desecularization of the World, arguing that most rich countries were becoming more secular, but not America. Not America, where you had, at the time, 80 million evangelicals and 72 million Catholics and 60 million mainline, 11 million African-American Christians, 3 million, Mormons, 5 million, 6 million Jews, and on and on. A very religious country. If you take it, you add it all up, it's like 80 or 90% back then. Well, now we've seen a massive decline. And so we think the project's still relevant, but there certainly is less religion in American life, and there's certainly less religion in European culture than there was maybe, a couple hundred years. So I think
I would think it's important. There's less formal, institutionally mediated religion. There is plenty of religion in America still. It just takes the form of things like QAnon. You need to. I think it's a really important point not to fall into the trap because the churches have declined. There are less bums on seat. Doesn't mean that we live in a less religious society.
And that's why Pew says that they get 28% is spiritual but not religious.
Argument, I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
I'm going to say these things are nothing like substitutes. They're nothing like equals. They are nothing like religion in the same sense.
I agree. I mean, yeah.
I'm not saying they're equals, but I'm just saying a purely sociological, like, what do we mean by religion,
right,
and the sacred,
right?
And when I think part of the problem, it's a problem that it's no longer institutionally mediated. I think that's a massive problem, precisely because it shows up in all sorts of pathological ways, like QAnon. And I think it's the question of then, what do we mean by religion? Yeah. And how does it show up in contemporary stuff? But to say that somehow QAnon is not a religious phenomenon, I just think, what are you talking about?
Sure, but Soul Cycle isn't the same thing as the communal benefits of. Okay, John Decker from Gray Television.
Thank you. Thanks you both.
Hit that button.
Presentation. You touched upon this a little bit earlier in a question that was asked by Shadi, and I wanted you to be forward-looking. I'm often asked about, just in the past few days, what does the election of Donald Trump mean for trade? What does it mean for security issues? And I wanted to ask you what you foresee as it relates to religion and faith in America, because we've had a president who served for the past 4 years who was very religious, who went to church every Saturday. And that is not what Donald Trump does. He talks about religion when it works for him, when it maybe is to his benefit. But for the most part, he doesn't talk much about faith or religion. Do you, either of you, see any changes in America over the course of the 4 years that he will serve in this realm?
Oh, I have no crystal ball, but I think his election, with historically strong support from white evangelicals, makes the headwind even stronger. They think they won a famous victory. Trump told them, as you know, vote for me this one last time and you'll never have to do it again. So their mind is not in an accommodating place, and their mind is not in a soul-searching place. So I think, if anything, it gets harder to try to reform Christianity in the direction we're discussing, while also making it even more important. But I don't know, John, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, Marcy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to always try and take a kind of paradoxical view. I think you'll see, and I think you already see, there's a kind of winnowing effect. And I think I see it in my students who, there's a kind of seriousness about their Christianity. This is at Duke Divinity School, where they are exploring forms of intentional community. They're thinking about much more radical forms of discipleship, because they're like, well, I can't kind of depend on a certain culture. We tend to kind of outsource discipleship to a kind of broader cultural formation. And so there has to be a level of intentionality, even as in the same moment, you're going to get people who are become hyper politicized and kind of the follow a broader pattern of the kind of hard right populist attempt to identify a particular political movement as the people of God. And so I think both of those will go hand in hand. I think my kind of, and I'll come back in 2 years' time and be proven entirely wrong, but I think you'll see forms of revival and forms of abject kind of corruption and collapse and all the rest of it go. But I think throughout the history of the church, those two things have tended to go together.
Yeah, Russell Moore's making the same point. He's saying there won't be a big schism, there won't be a split, but you'll see a lot of the church get more tightly focused on politics, and then you'll see an upwelling of church planting and smaller movements and grassroots change. And he said that's how the church has actually always worked.
I just want to follow up in a different area. The enormous rise of anti-Semitism that we see, not only in the United States, but worldwide. Again, you don't have a crystal ball, as you say, John, but what role does the president-elect, play in trying to diminish this? Because he has such a huge following. He has people that listen to every word that he utters, and they follow his lead.
Are you asking me what will Donald Trump do to reduce the level of contentiousness in civic culture? I think the question answers itself. He's a toxic provocateur. I expect nothing else than what he's done until now. So I can't be sunny about what we're confronting in the United States. But again, you tell me, you've covered the man. Do you see in him elements of reconciliation and cultural healing?
When it benefits him, yes, and when it benefited him, he was seeking another term in the White House. And so, he, as you know, John, reached out specifically to Jewish voters, Republican Jewish voters, those moderate, maybe those that, are Jewish, but like you are secular in nature. And that is when he's done it. But, now that he's achieved what it is that he wanted to achieve, which is a second term, I don't know. I mean, he has his focus and his eyes on other things that, are not in this area.
I think even his form of outreach invariably takes the form of, those people are out to get you, I will protect you. And that's not going to lead to a reduction in these conflicts. I think he's all about polarization and always will be. But I hope to be wrong.
All right, let's get 2 questions in before lunch, which is too good to miss. And by the way, lunch today will be outside, which is because of the weather being as good as it is, which should be lovely.
Written instructions to keep my replies very short, and I will try to do that.
All right, well, let's go to Christine Ockrent and then Bruno Massais, okay? So Christine Ockrent with French Culture.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to both of you for fascinating expose, and forgive me for being blunt and very European and even worse.
We would want
very
no less.
Secularly French. I cannot forget two moments in the American campaign. One is Donald Trump selling a Bible for $70 and saying, "This is my Bible and you have to buy it, and you know it's great reading." I think that's actually what he said. And another moment where after the assassination attempt, his daughter-in-law, who was bombarded as the leader of the Republican Party, 2 hours later showed a picture on social media with Jesus with his hands on Donald Trump's shoulders, protecting Donald Trump. So my question is, at this stage with the president-elect, is it, and forgive me for being blunt, but is it a sort of pathological demonstration of the decline of churches in the US today, or a sort of a manipulative version of American religiosity? Or is it both? Because the level of manipulation, it seems to me, and that gets back to the technological dimension of it, is really without any precedent.
It's not entirely without precedent, but it's gotten much worse. And yeah, it's both. It's coming from both directions at once.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so let's point to a parallel picture, which is the apotheosis of George Washington, which is painted on the Capitol, on the ceiling of the Capitol, where George Washington rises up to heaven, surrounded by angels and various figures doing obeisance. I'm not quite sure I see the difference between a picture of Donald Trump with Jesus on his hands and there in the foundation stone of liberal democracy, an apotheosis of George Washington rising up to heaven. Political orders always seek a sacral canopy. And that can take multitudes of forms. I don't think there's any political order without a political theology. This is just, I don't like it. I radically disagree with it. I have a counter-political theology. I think it's a terrible form of political theology. But the idea that somehow this is different from what's always been in America, or France, or Spain, or England, there's always a sacral canopy. The French Republic borrows a certain sacral order to legitimize and sanctify itself. And I just don't think political orders can resist that, because they always have to have an extra material structure of legitimation. They're never purely about tax differential policies. And so I just think we have to face the fact that, you know, this is a version of something that goes on everywhere. And so we can think of it as peculiarly odd because it feels a bit weird to us. But I think that says more about our misunderstanding of the relationship between politics and sacralization than it does to do with the oddness. I'm being slightly controversial here, but and agitational, but than it does about Donald Trump per se. Yeah, I mean, it makes me feel sick. But also, go into the United States Capitol and look up, and do you see anything different?
Trump's a little insta early compared to Washington, but Bruno Sayas, the foreign correspondent.
Yes, so I had one main concern during the two presentations. I'll try to frame it well. I thought both speakers gave a very good argument of why religion is not illiberal in itself. It doesn't have to be liberal. That didn't surprise me. You know, that was my assumption already. I couldn't imagine that the achievements of all the great religious traditions were compatible with that kind of illiberalism or with anti-human values. My problem is a different one, and I was interested that Luke, at a couple of points in this discussion, has said that we tend to give the benefit of the doubt to liberalism, modern liberalism, and never to religion. particularly when it comes to war. I personally don't think Israel-Palestine conflict is about religion at all, and I don't think the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict is about religion at all. From my experience talking to people there in both places, much more about land than about religion. So we tend to assume that religion is guilty. And when we talk about a compromise or reconciliation between religion and liberalism, I think both speakers show that religion can live up to that reconciliation. My question is whether liberalism can live up to that reconciliation, or whether we have to write books defending liberalism against the accusation of being anti-human and being irreligious and anti-religious. Look at the world today. Emma already talked about social media, which, Twitter is an image of hell. It's people on a binge of narcissism and aggression. Technology, the aspiration to replace man with God, to be immortal, to create an intelligence superior to man. Obscene levels of inequality and a sort of jubilation in that inequality, which I think is worse than the inequality itself. An arms industry that keeps pumping them arms to kill unspeakable numbers of children worldwide all the time, with very little concern, very little outcry about this. When I still remember the traditional Catholicism in Portugal 40 years ago, which seems to have disappeared, by the way, it was all about remembering death, remembering the moment of death. For a child, it was oppressive. Talking about death all the time. Now, in our modern societies, we deliberately forget about death. We have all kinds of techniques to forget about death. So, my conclusion is, how can this reconciliation between liberalism and religion be possible when, in fact, we look at modern liberalism? It's profoundly anti-religious, profoundly irreligious, and religious people, I'm not one of them, you may be surprised after this diatribe, demonic, I think many religious people would describe it as. And I think we see this. Okay, maybe the MAGA people and maybe the BJP people are not the best expression, but they're getting onto something.
So, wow, is that ever a question not suitable to a quick answer? And we have exactly 1 minute. I'm glad you brought it up. I mentioned that there's a lot of material in the book that there wasn't time to discuss here. And one of those is a specific discussion about the argument of post-liberals, which is very much like your argument, although coming more from the right than the left. They would talk about the undermining of family, for example, rather than the war machine of capitalism. And I argue that they are deeply confused about what liberalism is, and that the system, Bruno, which you just described, is not liberalism. It includes secularism, for example, which, as Luke has ably pointed out, is not really the liberal tradition. Liberalism is a carefully enunciated system of rights and responsibilities. It is not anything goes. It is not no responsibility to others. It is not Randian libertarianism. It begins with the proposition that all human beings are created free and equal, and then it built upon that a structure of rights and responsibilities which says, far from being all about personal autonomy at all costs, the core commitment of liberalism is to restrain yourself to protect and observe the rights of others, which is very difficult to do. Liberalism is all about self-restraint and regulation, and the founders told us this again and again. They said, you've got to base the American constitutional system on a substrate of civic values, what they called civic virtues, or it will collapse. The liberal tradition is all about, from Locke onward, Tocqueville, Madison, Adams said this, Washington said it. They all warned us that liberalism will collapse. It is not self-sufficient. It is not enough by itself. It must rely on civic virtue, and that will require forms of civic education. It will require virtue on the part of the citizenry, things like not lying, the values that I discussed earlier, which in many ways map to Christianity. And so the liberal project today is about reminding secular moderns about their obligations under liberalism. And I think people like me have failed at that. I also think, on the other hand, we are seeing increasing awareness in the liberal movement, the center right and the center left, about recovering and reminding people of those traditions.
Yep, just very, very
It's
quickly.
a much longer conversation, which I would love to have. It's the thing I think about more than anything else, is the liberal.
So if you're lucky enough to get a seat with John or with Luke today, you're going to enjoy it because there's a lot more there, and there's a lot more.
Am I holding fire?
I mean,
okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Let's just find him at lunch. Okay, so here's the deal. This first session was like a double espresso, and we thank John and Luke so very much. Really, that was great. That's awesome.